Welcome to the Excellence at Work podcast, where we explore the strategies and best practices that drive business success. I'm Rachel Cook, COO of Brandon Hall Group and the host of our podcast, along with members of our executive team. In each episode, we'll dive into the latest trends, insights, and real-world examples from some of the most exciting leaders from organizations worldwide. Be part of our journey and learn from the best as we discuss innovative approaches and cutting-edge technologies for talent management, learning and development, leadership, diversity and inclusion, and more.
Hi, I'm David Forry, Senior Vice President at Brandon Hall Group. Welcome to today's show. We're going to explore how organizations turn hiring from an operational burden into an engine of strategic growth, and why some companies get it right while others don't. Quick framing before my guests join. At Brandon Hall Group, we're seeing a clear shift. Talent acquisition is no longer just filling roles. It's becoming a capability engine, a continuous function that forecasts capabilities, orchestrates candidate experiences, and connects recruiting with learning, career development, and workforce planning. When TA can demonstrate measurable business impact, faster time to productivity, reduced regrettable attrition, improved performance, it earns a seat at the CEO's table. Two quick research-backed points I want to leave you with before we dive in. AI is a powerful amplifier of TA. Predictive matching, candidate orchestration, bias detection, but it only delivers when organizations have data standards, governance, and human oversight. Put another way, AI without skills taxonomy is a shared definitions, is often brittle. The progression matters. The most successful companies follow a maturity path. Foundations first, data taxonomies, processes, then integrates platforms, and finally, continuous AI orchestration. That's how you get scale without sacrificing fairness or candidate experience. Okay, with that context, I'm thrilled to welcome two guests whose work speaks exactly to these shifts. Jeff, David, welcome to the show.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you, David.
So quick round of intros here. Jeff Abbott is the former CEO of Ivanti, who grew Ivanti from about 400 million to 1 billion in revenue and led the company through massive scaling across 40,000 customers and 140 countries. Jeff has deep operational and leadership experience and has been at the center of hiring and scaling for a high growth enterprise software companies. And David Nason is the founder and CEO of HireBrain, a hiring enablement platform that reimagines hiring from the inside out. David has built HireBrain to translate business strategy into precise hiring requirements and guide every participant through science-based, context-aware hiring pathways. Great to have you both.
Great, thanks.
Happy to be here.
So let's get started with the big picture. Jeff, as somebody that's been in the CEO seat, when does talent shift from being an HR issue to a growth lever? And what moment did you feel hiring quality was affecting Ivanti's business performance?
Yeah, that's a great way to start, David. I've said quite often, and Mr. Nason knows this quite well, that one of the last sustainable competitive advantages in contemporary business is the quality of your team. And that begins with the quality of your hiring. So I have seen situations where CEOs come in and they bring in their own executive squad, from previous jobs. And that can be good, but it creates tension. The company at large will look at that and say, oh, now it's this whole new squad of people. And, sometimes the squad feels, like, well, we're not as valued as this new squad that all came from the same previous company and so on. So I think open market hiring of key leadership positions has become very strategic and a must for a lot of leadership. And that partnership between the executive leadership team and HR and the internal recruiting team is really critical. In fact, the best recruiting executives I've worked with, and David is chief among them, they require that their business leader counterparts are actively involved and investing time appropriately in the description of the job, in the business outcomes that it should drive, the design of the onboarding, and so on. And when you do that right, to your question about the shift, from just a, kind of a day in the life HR issue to now a strategic growth lever. When you do it right and you fit the pieces with the right leadership in place, that's when you get the target business outcomes you're looking for, and you get it at an accelerated rate. And I would tell you that since the shift to remote work over the past 5 or 6 years with COVID and everything else, it's become even more critical. You can't miss these days. You've got to get hiring right. But again, when you do, you get accelerated business outcomes from those.
That's a great framing. Thank you so much. David, from your work with enterprises, where do you typically see the disconnect between business strategy and hiring decisions? And how does HireBrain address that?
Yeah, it's interesting. So, I grew up in a world that was infused with science. My father was a microbiology professor for 45 years. My brother has a PhD in neurobiology. And I've always applied the scientific method at work. And it's interesting, an interview and a hiring process is a social experience. And so when we use and describe what we need in a hire as what we're looking for, what does good look like, things like that, we're priming brains to be looking for visual cues. It's also a very high stakes scenario, right? If the hire works out, great. But that's not what's happening in the minds of managers and other evaluators during a hiring process generally. And we understand this from a long-term study that we've been doing at a major university that shows that both parties in an interview process, that their physiological, their neurological response to that social situation is one that's fear-based, anxiety-based. So for a hiring manager, and when we're in that state, we're thinking less about business outcomes, if you will, right? And more about, do I think this person, I'm going to get along with this person, right? Would I invite them over? I used to love that one. Could I have them over, for a beer? Or the Cleveland airport test, if I got stuck at an airport with them for 2 hours. And I used to love, especially, I remember sales conversations with sales managers. And I would say, well, let me ask you a question. If they come in at the end of the year at 150% of quota, you think you could have a beer with them? They're like, oh yeah, well, that's a good frame of reference framing. So HireBrain provides actionable decision support to people at the point of need during a hiring cycle. And then if we have an opportunity to get into it, we're moving now, David, into employee performance and the entire performance lifecycle, which is coming out here next quarter. But HireBrain consumes business information, business strategy, operating models, et cetera. And then it applies that framework to each and every job so that every job has a clear objectives that are in service of reaching business outcomes. So the great thing is when we're in that high stakes environment, right? Our barometer, the things that we're thinking about, our framework is what's the job that needs to be done, the challenges to overcome, et cetera, in the role. We're not thinking about things that are cultural based, if that makes sense. So, and it gives both interviewers and candidates a high degree of confidence as well, because we're having a business conversation about the things that I can do, my abilities, my skills, right, my own motivations, et cetera, versus the other kinds of things that we hear are on our long list of favorite terrible interview questions that people ask.
Yeah, certainly. There's an interview that I went on several years ago that lives rent-free in my brain. And they asked me how many boxes of shoes would fit in this conference room. And of course, I try to answer it, coming from more of like an engineering and manufacturing background with the idea of what size my shoe boxes would be. And of course, I had the answer wrong. The correct answer was asking the person what size shoes there are.
Right.
I feel like it's very similar, but certainly lives rent-free up in my brain to this day. And it's been probably 15 years since I was in that interview.
Absolutely. That's one of the top reasons for hiring mistakes is questions that are not, business relevant, right? Putting somebody in the spot in a way that is not related to the job that they'd actually be doing.
So that's a great transition to talking more about alignment. And this is where a lot of trouble starts, is when there's misalignment between the hiring and the business needs. So Jeff, what does executive alignment around hiring actually look like in practice? Where does it tend to break down first?
Yeah, I think strong executive alignment in hiring is evident in a couple of places. First, agreement on the specific expectations of the role. That's not just the line and staff reporting structure. It's again, and David and I are really driving this point home. It's about the business outcomes and making sure that everyone's in agreement on what the particular leader or executive is expected to drive. And you would think that's an easy box to check, but I'm telling you, the variety of expectations that I've seen after a hire is made can be pretty surprising, the contrasting points of view. So it's worth going around the horn with the key peers of the target role, as well as sometimes, depending on the seniority of the role, even board members for input, and not just the CEO or the C-suite doing the hiring. And secondly, perhaps a little surprising, I would say the cultural fit across the executive leadership team, or ELT, and David touched on this. I can't stress this enough. Harmony amongst the executive team, especially, again, going back to what I said earlier, in today's remote leadership, the models that are pretty prevalent today, that cultural fit has to be exceptionally strong. And going the extra mile in designing and collaborating on the role and the expectations of the role across the ELT, again, for target new executives, including the job spec, the target business outcomes, the interaction with the other teams. That's a lot of work, but it also sets the proper expectation across the ELT on what the role, how big is the role going to be, and what is it going to drive across the extended team. And when that's done right, that new executive, and I said this earlier, will be able to walk in and accelerate relatively quickly into their role. They're supported early on because the rest of the ELT not only knows, but has a stake in their success. And, these days, no one has time or patience for that show me what you can do model, right? Everyone wants to get behind a new executive because it's so critical to the mutual success of the entire team. That's what I've seen. But I can't stress enough, taking the time up front to go around the horn with the peer roles, sometimes even senior leadership and board members, and then carefully curating and designing what success looks like for the role can create the perfect outcome once the hire's made.
I love that example. What we're seeing is that improving manager participation and quality of intake conversations is often one of the single biggest signals of a healthier hiring alignment. And I know HireBrain's work highlights improvement of the intake participation as practical lever for change. So David, HireBrain emphasizes guided intake and role design. What common mistakes do you see when managers skip or rush the intake, and how do you coach them to do it differently?
Yeah, so it's interesting. There's never really been good statistics on the number of intake meetings per open position. We've never captured that before. Sometimes some companies have used kind of a checkbox exercise, et cetera. But what we are discovering is that it averages right around 20%, varying between 18% and 22% when we begin the engagement. It was fascinating to me, when we were testing intake before the prompts, et cetera, were there, before the guided pathway was there. It struck me immediately that not every hiring manager knows what an intake meeting is. Also, a lot of recruiters didn't really know what the strategic purpose is of an intake meeting. And so our assumption, our overall strategy as it relates to the user experience is guidance, visibility, and compliance. And in that order, we need to have compliance, and organizations need to have compliance, but we start with guidance and visibility. So the question is, every outcome of a bad hire, that's what happens when we don't have a good strategic intake meeting. The alignment, et cetera, right? We make hiring decisions based on things like, personalities and perceived likability, et cetera, versus whether or not the person has the skills, knowledge, and abilities, right? Desire, motivation, right? To do the job. So what we immediately, before we even launched intake, we created a guided pathway. So now, as soon as the meeting is scheduled, as soon as a position has been approved, a hiring manager and the recruiter, they both get their own message. And in that message, it's very simple. What is an intake meeting? What's in it for you to participate? How to prepare for this meeting? What to expect in this meeting and what you're going to get out of it? And for the recruiter, very similar. It also can give a primer about who they're meeting with, what's the organization, et cetera. Today with HR and recruiting budgets continuing to get compressed, we have recruiters who are now supporting lots of different types of positions when maybe last year they only worked, with one type of an organization, and yet we expect them to be an expert on who their audience is. The other thing is that most managers at enterprise companies, they don't hire very often. They maybe hire only once a year, every other year. And then they show up to the process. And this can be a leader, right? Or somebody who has a large organization. They haven't hired anybody in 2 years. Or maybe they just got promoted and they've never hired, right? The people who used to be their peers, now they need to hire somebody of that caliber. So understanding that and being able to provide information and guidance in the flow of work does a couple of beautiful things. One is it takes the pressure off. So there's nobody like beating somebody over the head. You're dumb, you're an idiot, hiring managers are terrible, all the things that we hear, right? So when you take that pressure away and you provide somebody with reasonable, meaningful guidance, it's a beautiful thing and it's a beautiful experience. Yeah, the participation in intake meetings literally within 60 days goes from an average of 18 to 22% to in the 60s. It tops out in the high 80s. Arguably, you're not going to have an intake role. Sometimes you're hiring for 2 or 3 positions at a time. So 100% is also not appropriate. And the quality, if you will, of the information that's shared too in every single area and the outcomes speak for themselves. A 60 to 70% reduction in regrettable hires, early attrition. It's phenomenal, right? Time to value, time to productivity and sales, time to quota, time to first deal. Every single measurable area of success is significantly improved. And this happens within 2 quarters. It's very, very fast because it's it's an enjoyable experience. The manager gets a full and complete analysis of the conversation that they had. And here's the other thing that's fun for it, because we're context aware. If they didn't happen to mention some things that are critically important, the system's going to provide it to them. So it's there. So I forgot to mention this, or maybe I didn't even know. Having that, assuming that people are busy, they're trying to be successful, et cetera, and providing something in the flow of work that's helpful and helps them to do their job. That's our goal on planet Earth. That's what we live for every single day.
I want to jump in on a couple of points David made, from the senior executive or CEO's desk. First of all, when you spoke about regrettable hires, I will tell you, regrettable hires is more damaging overall than getting a hire right? Accelerating the downward trends from regrettable hires does, again, it takes away from sales and customer retention and just overall momentum faster than getting a hire right. So that's why that metric is so meaningful, reducing regrettable hires. And secondly, one of the reasons I'm so excited about HireBrain, and I really believe David and his team are onto a very big gap in today's sort of enterprise solutions footprint for an average business, is, I think about over the past 4 or 5 years, and I'm talking about some of the most critical hires I've made. When I have sat back and designed the role, I've sought some feedback. Like I said, gone around the horn with some of the key players. But then when it came to the actual hiring, that intake discussion David was giving, and assigning each of the different interviewers areas of the candidates to go deep in and to get a sense for. And then I would, and this is all through email. There's no workflows and guidance, as David said, that HireBrain now provides. I can't tell you the number of times from exceptionally senior people, the feedback I got was a thumbs up emoji. And that's it, right? Versus everything I asked for in the interview and the evaluation of the candidate. Hey, I was just checking in to see it's been a few days. What did you think? Can you give me your feedback? Thumbs up emoji. But that does not do the job, right? And it doesn't breed confidence. What it says is, I'm not sure how to structure my answer to you. I don't really have a lot of time and focus on this, and so on. And this has come from the chief's desk, right? But when you get 4 out of 5 answers, either so-so or thumbs up emoji or just a few lines, what HireBrain is now providing with that structured process and that guidance to everyone involved in the process is just, it's a gap. It's not out there anywhere. In any of the, even in Workday, I haven't seen it, right? So this is filling an incredibly critical gap for getting hiring right.
Great insights. And, you started to get a little bit reflective and practical. So I think it'd be a good time to talk a little bit about the Ivanti story. Jeff, what prompted you to take a more structured approach to hiring at Ivanti? And what was it, a specific inflection point that caused you?
Yeah, at the risk of having convulsions and thinking back to some very bad moments, you said at the outset, David, you're right. We brought 5 companies together and we did that in 18 months. And oh, by the way, we did that during COVID. I don't recommend that. And went from 400 million to $1 billion in revenue, went from 2,500 employees to 4,000 employees. And at the same time, we had 2 or 3 very key roles to fill. Often when you're doing acquisitions and you're structuring a platform strategy, which is what Ivanti is in the cybersecurity and IT infrastructure space, you need to have leaders that have worked at scale, say, $1 billion and above. And when you do those acquisitions, a lot of times the executives you are acquiring don't have that experience. So you have to go out and hire. And getting those hires right equaled, from a business perspective, equaled not only sustaining sales growth and customer retention across all of those acquired products, but again, I need to stress the cultural side. We needed to establish a one Ivanti culture versus everybody thinking, oh, I'm just, I'm part of my old legacy company and now I've joined this mothership. I'm not sure where I fit. So we needed every employee to transition their focus and identity from, again, their acquired company to being wholeheartedly in on the combined Ivanti mission. And that was the pivot point you're asking about, David. It takes a little bit of time, but we realized when you get this right and you put the right executives in place who know how to take multiple cultures and multiple products and develop a harmony amongst the employees, that, when it fires on all cylinders, that becomes very evident to the customers. And they can appreciate that you are now building something that the entire 4,000 employees are behind around the world. And I should say, by contrast, when you get it wrong, and this is what I meant by, having a seizure right here on the podcast, and I got it wrong in a couple of spots. And I remember having these conversations with David, who was my head of recruiting at the time, went with a lot of folks' recommendations, even though my own intuition wasn't entirely decided on this individual, which was a very key role in the head of development organization. But you discover situations where entire groups of employees are going very, very quiet because there's a dictatorship mentality in that group, and it is not joining the One Ivanti mission, and it is really bad. And when you discover that, you feel as the senior most leader in the company to correct it and correct it fast. And what I learned from that experience is when you do discover that, act fast, cut your losses, move on. Because as I said earlier, the damage that can be done from regrettable hires exceeds the upside of good hires. So yeah, it was at that pivot point of building an important combined culture of a bunch of acquisitions and knowing that I had made a bad move, that I kind of sat back with David and redesigned our recruiting strategy in a much more thorough and focused, curated fashion.
That's a really powerful story. And I think your employees can really appreciate that, thoughtful look at how you were shaping their day-to-day work. Because if they have to report to someone or they have to even work with somebody that they know is a bad hire, they feel it themselves, but they also think it's, bad judgment on the organization itself. So that ripple effect.
Confidence in the overall, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Dave. Confidence in the overall leadership team will drop the longer you keep that bad seat.
Right. And usually after you spend all that time hiring somebody, you want to try to make it work, or maybe you neglect to see what's right in front of you. So you look past certain things, and then it's kind of devastation.
It is. And I'll tell you, the peer group of the bad seed will often feel like, wow, I guess the bar has been lowered for all of us. No. It's not, right? But you just have to face that quickly. And as I said, cut your losses and move on fast.
David.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to ask you your perspective from working with them. When you saw the leadership engagement there, what impact really showed up first for you? Was it the clarity, the speed, the retention? Was it an engagement from the employees?
Yeah, I appreciate that. There are a couple of different areas. I do actually want to touch on something that Jeff said also really quickly. And Jeff said my intuition was different ultimately than the recommended decision. We've kind of, if you spend a lot of time, on LinkedIn or other platforms, and you read the things that professional writers, if you will, are writing, there's a critical area that's gotten wrong. And that's the conversation in and around bias and intuition. The thing is that our intuition is exceedingly helpful to us. The way that our brains make decisions is exceedingly helpful to us. Bias is just a scientific term to describe our automatic decision-making process. And when we're successful in life, those automatic decisions are made within a framework. And that description of it, I hear all the time, making decisions just on gut feel. Part of your gut is exceedingly valuable. What's important is if we identify what success is, how we're going to measure performance in a role, what the roadmap, if you will, to reach those success points first, we shift the framework in our brain. And that gut, when our gut tells, I say this, I've done it back when I was doing interviewing and hiring training. If your gut at the end of the day, you cannot get rid of a feeling, my opinion is don't override that. Don't override that. Now, when that feeling is not based on sound business, like we literally go through a scorecard, right? And this is a sound business decision. In those cases, right, we go by the data, right, or the facts. But I think it's really important that we're human beings. At least as of right now, we're not going to be replaced by machines, which by the way, are also based on a framework that may or may not be helpful in every single situation. So I wanted to share that. I think when you talk about, to go to your question about alignment. So one of the things that we did at Ivanti was Jeff took some time, very thoughtful time with executive leadership, et cetera, to build the core values that the company ascribed to. And those had a meaningful, practical purpose. So it wasn't just a culture statement that goes out on a board that's very disconnected from the way when we went through this exercise, every single one of these 4 core principles had to be rooted in, well, what is this? How are we going to know whether this behavior is consistent with that value? In the recruiting and the HR organization, in recruiting, we took those and we put them on every single job description as related to that particular role. So it wasn't just so that one of them was locking arms, for instance. And in the job description, in the requirements and scorecards, we defined what locking arms, right, actually was in relation to that role and that team. And that's how you get alignment. It isn't once a year getting together every quarter on a company meeting or something, like that. It's not just a pizza party, if you will, right? It is taking the time to define those as it relates to the actual organization. And that's where you find meaningful value and purpose. That's where engagement comes from. People who are highly skilled, but they're not engaged. The way to get an organization that's engaged and make better hiring decisions that is aligned with that is both taking that time and then making it present throughout the entire process, so that when people show up on the first day, that's not the first time they're hearing about the 4 core values, right? They've heard about them the entire process. Is that helpful the way did I just answer your question well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great way to see value early on. You get a lot of value in reimagining the company's values. And then when you turn around and you have that employee value proposition right, and you go out to the market or you even work internally, you see a lot of value on getting that right. Now, being that there were multiple organizations that came in, did you see much resistance to those core values, either from managers or different business units?
Well, I have a methodology, David. And that methodology includes things like I said includes, I'm going to say it again, including people in the conversation and in the dynamic, and not coming in and kind of like a big thing. And this is what companies are able to do with the platform. It's not something where something is handed down to you or there's an edict, if you will. You participate in the process. And those kinds of activities happen within HireBrain as well. The great thing is by having an application for every stage of a hiring process, from planning all the way through onboarding, is that the information is consistent throughout every one of those things. And by the way, it's also visible. You can go in and you can see it. And we may have been right about these things. We can learn, because some of the areas that we thought were really important, we find they were less important than we thought. So the next time we can learn from that, because again, it's in a place that's visible. And tomorrow, when we launch the employee experience, that information is going to be cascaded and available throughout your entire employment experience. So I start with a great onboarding plan, but then during performance management in 12 months from now, We build a new plan using the same types of principles, right? Using those same types of the values, et cetera. And all of that is 100% customizable to the organization. So the way that it behaves for one organization can be very, very different than others. Did I, there's always resistance. There's always resistance, but, having a message, repeating that message, bringing people into the conversation so that they feel ownership over it as well. They've not only been heard, but their voice has had an impact, right? Those things are key. And that's something that was very important to Jeff. It was interesting. I'm not sure exactly when. I remember meeting with him early, and I used to say that I got this from Jeff. He's like, I want this to be a great place to work, but I want people to actually like experience that. Like they want to come here, they want to participate, they feel welcomed here. And so we used to describe that as, Avanti is the kind of place that, it's absolutely objective based, leadership, et cetera, right? We have business objectives and we're going to reach those, but it's a place where people are nice. And if you get a phone call and you're not the right person to answer the question, you don't just say, I'm not the right person, or just pass the buck. You walk them down the hall. Of course, that had to be done virtually, right? But that became pervasive, throughout the entire organization. And so, yes, I mean, there's always, resistance to change, but my philosophy is, seek to understand first and then appeal to others based on their self-interests. That's the key to success.
It's extremely well put, David. And there's a lot that you can say about the company's culture based on how the employees feel Sunday night before they know that they have to spend 5 more days with the organization. So I love that approach that you all took. And if we could zoom out a little bit and look towards the future, Jeff, I know that you sit on some boards, and if you were advising a CEO, what would you make their top 3 priorities?
Wow. Gosh. I mean, as it relates to this topic, look, recruiting, developing, and retaining best talent has never been a more important competence for a CEO. And I think the CEOs, and by the way, CEO tenure is shrinking fast, right? The patience for performance is shrinking. So you got to have thick skin, but you also have to have an eye for, again, attracting, developing, and retaining best talent. I put that number 1 on the list. After that, listen, the launch of generative AI a few years ago and the impact it's having on the business community at large around the world is pretty staggering. I mean, by some estimates, backfilling jobs as a result of normal attrition is projected to drop by 50% in the next few years. Let's wait and see if we need that backfill. So understanding the impact of AI on processes and strategy and getting real business value from it, I think is probably number 2 on my list. And we're not there yet. No one in the business community has it fully figured out. There's a lot of room for exploration and experimentation to get it right. And then third, I think David would be, and Mr. Nason was just commenting on this, is culture. And I think to his point, the phrase that I used is, I want Ivanti to be a destination company.
Mm-hmm.
People look at that brand and say, I really need to spend at least 1 or 2 chapters of my career at Ivanti. I've heard so many good things. And I think that needs to be a competence and a goal of every CEO, to drive the culture and the experience for the employees to be a destination company, one they really want to spend time and develop their career at. And that, again, you put that together, and I'll underscore one of my original points. This is one of the last sustainable strategic competitive advantages there is in business: is best teams, best people, best teams, best culture.
That's great. And yes, thank you for focusing in on, this conversation. I should have mentioned, taking it from a hiring approach. At Brandon Hall Group, what we're seeing is that in the near term, priority for CEOs is that capability intelligence and that shared skills taxonomy. So common data standards and governance. So you mentioned your second point around AI becomes reliable and fair at scale. With those foundations scaling, higher enablement is certainly risky. So David, kind of back to you. How do you balance AI structure and human judgment and HireBrain's approach? Where should companies be cautious or curious?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think Well, I can tell you where they are being cautious with or without my guidance. And here's the challenge. And, we were hearing these statistics now that AI investments and services, et cetera, have been in market for, a couple of years. 95% of AI investments fail. And here's the challenge, and here's the problem, and this is what people are afraid of, is that a generalized large language model of the ones that are commercially available today, everybody is effectively working even in even greater silos on their own. Their ability to interact with the machine to get a result, and the result may or may not be consistent with what the organizational performance objectives. And people are spending a lot of time. It's the new Facebook. I've heard that term used a lot of time. I've heard people talk about arguing with their model as almost like not a pastime, but it's a massive time waste. It's a massive time waste. And I think as we have to remember that those systems were based on they have their own rules-based system, their own governance system, okay, their own personality to a certain degree, right? They're built to please us and things like that, for instance. I heard this from a large vendor who we have a great relationship with. I'll leave them out. They said that the data in performance management systems today is 10 or 50 times worse than it was last year when we did it manually, because we're just going into our blank model. We're saying, this is what I'm being judged on, say all the great things that I did, and then we're copying and pasting that into our system of record. And, we started, there's a stark difference. One of them is that, with our science advisory team, we have infused behavioral science into the platform, the way that it behaves, the way that your experiences with it, et cetera. So it's built on the way that human beings actually think and behave. And that's different than what we hear, right? I mean, we hear about these massive companies that are exploding in the multi-billion-dollar valuations in a very particular structure that may or may not be consistent with human behavior. So that's really scary. And I think that we're at an interesting inflection point in the profession of recruiting. I'm hearing this every single day. Every recruiting organization, HR organization, they're in fear, for their profession, right? For their livelihoods. And I think that the way that, and this isn't just my own opinion for sure, and it's not an opinion based on nothing, but transitioning as a profession into becoming a true business advisor, that's not just survival, okay? I would argue that that's what we should all be doing anyway. But literally, I think the profession, and certainly on an organizational level, your survival depends on it. I would also argue it's a lot more fun to provide real business value. It's scary sometimes, but you don't always agree. And like you said before, when you get resistance and things like that, but that's part of having a valuable professional, experience. Is I'm not always 100% right in every single situation, right? Other people also have a valid perspective based on their experiences. So I think that in terms of how we're evaluating things, we need to be really careful to understand what's the rules-based system, how customizable is it, how malleable is it. I heard this week from a highly skilled professional, I'll leave it at that. They've had 5 AI bot interviews from 5 different companies. They were the exact same questions. It was the same format, okay? Right? Because it has no context. It's based on a very, brief job description that's not a very high value and doesn't actually describe the job. So you put that job description into that bot, okay? And it asks the same questions. 5 different companies. The scariest one was for one of them, for the company name, it said at pharma company. It didn't even have the company name in there, but we're doing these pilots, right? And the candidate marketplace, that's how they're experiencing your company. Now, am I saying that all AI driven, hiring technologies are bad? I am absolutely not saying that in any way, shape, or form. There'll be innovations in that field. I'm not saying that, but what I am saying is that we need to be careful when we're evaluating these tools and technology to understand how they really operate, right? Understand where our data is going, okay? And what level of control and influence we as business professionals and companies have over the behavior of those
That's great feedback. I think looking at the talent acquisition market, we probably have some of the coolest AI tools of any HR department. But we also have a system that is probably more broken than any other department within human resources. So, being smart, and it goes back to that alignment that we talked about at the beginning of the podcast. Does it align to the business? How does it align? We're not just throwing a cool, shiny object at it, expecting us to be able to hire our way out of a problem. So I think, being very smart and approach AI with the right usage. And to kind of transition back into the hiring enablement, do you think that is going to become a core executive capability over the next couple of years? And if so, is it going to sit more like the CHRO, Chief Talent Officer, or maybe like the CIO? Like, is it more, something for them to get involved? Where does that really sit in the capabilities department?
Yeah, that's interesting. I grew up, well, beside my, very early first few years in career in recruiting. And, I still say, oftentimes I said, that's still my tribe. I love the profession. I'm very passionate about it. Anybody who's ever been part of my organizations would tell you that that's absolutely true. I believe in continual improvement, continual training on the basics on a regular basis. You could call one of these folks in the middle of the night and, wake them up and say, a candidate is a candidate what? And they'll say if they're qualified, available, and interested. Things like that, right? Because it makes a difference, right? I want to make a difference. So your question is, it sits in all of those areas. But we exist to empower the office of the CHRO, leaders of talent acquisition organizations, to have a business impact and improve the business relationships that they have with the organizations that they support by using this platform. And that's what they're experiencing. So it sits in all of those offices. But I, for one, would love for that to be strategically driven from HR, from talent acquisition.
Wonderful. And as we wrap up this podcast today, of course, I want to say thank you, but I also want to leave you both with the chance to leave your closing thoughts. And perhaps if you would answer one last question from me each. Jeff, one practical advice for CEOs who want to make hiring a growth lever this year.
Yeah, I would say make sure that that's not in isolation. If you're going to make recruiting and hiring a core competence, it is the job of the entire ELT. And adopting solutions such as HireBrain and others that can enable that is a great investment. Just, I'll use the expression that we use at Ivanti, locking arms and working as a team to establish what does great recruiting and hiring look like and how will it impact the larger organization, making that, a 2-day offsite or longer, whatever it takes to kind of indoctrinate that competence across the ELT would be my advice. And it is, again, it's no longer a check the box HR, process. It is a must-have core competence. It was number one on my list to you, David. So that would be my advice. And the good news is, all boats are rising in this regard. I think the recruiting support organizations that are out there are recognizing that they can get better, stronger, faster, and become more strategic to the ELT and the board of directors, and therefore they're exercising the right muscles to be better and better and stronger. And David was that to me at Ivanti. So the good news is the stars are aligning around this as a competence. It's just a matter of making it an appropriate focus of the organization.
Wonderful. And David, how about one practical step an HR leader can take tomorrow to make hiring more strategic?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think that the number one thing is moving past maybe like the obvious questions sometimes and really understand what are the business goals we're trying to achieve here. And it may sound a little bit easier than it is to achieve, especially, as we get in, we've been in an organization for a while and we have a specific kind of relationship that is working for us. To come with a new idea or a new question, sometimes, might feel, scary. But ultimately, in the world of AI, our work is becoming more and more disconnected from business outcomes. Right. So the number one thing is, what are we trying to achieve here? What are our goals? How are we going to measure it? And having some challenges when we start talking about things in this type of a context So we're going to be wrong about some stuff. It is effectively an experiment. That's what, a social scientist would come in here and tell us we're going to be right about. So we need to have some tolerance for areas where we're wrong or we might fail in a particular area. And, but at the end of the day, the existence of the profession depends on it. I would also argue that as a community, that our way of life in a lot of ways, we can give it over and have someone else making decisions for us, or we can participate and work together and have get to a place where it's a better day.
Jeff, David, this has been terrific. Thank you for your candid examples and practical advice. Hopefully we can have you both back again here soon.
Love that. Thank you, David.
Yeah, thanks, David. Thanks for having us.
Today's conversation reinforced a simple truth. Hiring done well is a strategic advantage, and the path to doing it well is deliberate. Build the foundations, shared skills, common data standards, and enable managers with structured intake and role design. Pilot AI with governance and measure hiring's impact on real business outcomes. If you like this episode, please subscribe to our channel. We'll be back soon with another conversation on how HR and TA are evolving in the AI era. Thanks again to Jeff Abbott and David Nason, and thank you for listening.